Hi Year 10, it's Miss Payne again, here with Poetry Shot Session 8. Today it's Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw in raw-seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment then he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who has jumped up in the dark and runs, listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide open silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm to get out of that blue crackling air. His terrors, touchy dynamite. Ooh, another dramatic battle scene there. Again, in the title, we have got that verb charge, and of course we can see that a charge is very active. It's something that you have to do. It's going forwards at speed. And when we combine that with a bayonet, it's quite a daunting title really, because we see men having to run forwards with the very idea of embedding that bayonet into somebody else's chest. That's quite a distinct thing from shooting somebody. A bayonet is there really if your rifle fails, you've then got an additional weapon to protect yourself. But if you're running into gunfire and that's the only thing that you've got, you're pretty much cannon fodder. The context of this poem brings in the themes of the countryside, and think again about the relationship between war and nature in this poem. You see how the boundaries between the two things become blurred. The natural world takes on imagery of war. We'll talk about that when we link into assessment objective 2. There's also lots of aspects of human history in here and mythology that's already influenced by the imagination of the writer. And certainly this influenced his poetry when he started writing it as a student. Hughes writes creatively about inner conflict and how man often battles with himself as well as others. So within this particular poem, you're seeing a man that is absolutely terrified and finds himself in a state of suspended animation. He's so afraid at one point that he finds himself unable to move. Within the poem, Hughes is also covering this sense of pride and honour that, you know, individuals had for one's king and country. But all of that can go somewhere and do one when you're facing death, when you're staring it in the face. All of those ideas melt away. We need to think about how there is a sense of futility or pointlessness that comes through in this poem. Man is reduced to something that could so easily be disposed of. He is something that can just be discarded. Human life doesn't seem to matter when you're in a state of conflict. You become a number, something that doesn't really have any importance. Bayonet Charge for Ted Hughes is quite an unusual poem because it focuses on a nameless soldier in the First World War. It's not really his type of thing. Ted Hughes is famous quite often for his animal poems, as well as for other things too. And the poem really tries to step inside the body and mind of a soldier, carrying out one of the most terrifying acts of the war. Like I said when discussing the title with you, that sense of charging straight into rifle fire with the aim of killing an enemy face to face with a bayonet just seems absolutely incomprehensible to our modern minds. So by doing this, Hughes is really dramatising the struggle between a man's thoughts and his actions. This doesn't always apply to war. We can apply this to every day. We are very much in a state of mental conflict all of the time. So for example, I've recorded this particular poem about 3 times already today, because for some reason my brain just wouldn't read the words in the right meter. You possibly wouldn't have noticed the tiny stumble, but for me, the conflict about whether to seem professional or to just say, oh, that will do, is something that was just a very minor inner conflict, but we're constantly having those every day on either a large or a small level. When we think about this, this again reflects the experiences of going over the top. So this is when soldiers hiding in trenches were ordered to fix bayonets and to then climb out of the trenches, which were only 20 or 30 meters away. But just imagine how big that distance would have felt. It would have felt like miles, a marathon. The aim of doing this was to really catch an enemy trench, but that wasn't an easy thing to do. And the poem actually describes how this process of having to drum up the courage from somewhere within to do that, to follow orders when you know that the likelihood of you surviving is very slim, and how it really transforms a soldier from a living, thinking human being into a dangerous weapon of war. The man himself is becoming even more dangerous than the bayonet or the rifle that he carries. Because when you get into that mindset, you are unstoppable with one thing in your mind, and that's killing. AO2, let's rock and roll. So here we see lots of frantic action of battle, and then the thickness, the difficulty that the mud is giving to the soldiers. In the middle of all of this, there is a sudden fear, and then the clear thoughts of the soldier. There's a little connection here to structure, because what we actually see is the pausing, the caesura. It's almost like someone dragging themselves along in the mud that's almost trying to suck you down. And all of these feelings are presented in the images that we see, and certainly as well as the imagery that you can hear within the poem. So let's look at that sound imagery first of all. And what is really striking to me as your English teacher is this sense of dense repetition that Hughes uses from words and sounds right from the beginning of the text. So in stanza 1, we've got this repeated h sound, h. So it's that sense of heavy breathing. That comes with both exertion, so when you're doing something very physical, but also when you're anxious too, that sort of adrenaline that's coursing through your veins, that whole fight or flight situation. So those sounds are very, very realistic. The imagery, as I've mentioned, the rich descriptions that we have contrast with where the soldier is heading. Now, in line 3, we have got a very, very simple, almost childish description. We've got this idea of stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge. Ooh, let's look at that lovely green hedge. We might just think that that is the natural world, but let's think about in wartime how that will have been destroyed. You know, with the constant shelling and things like that, there will be no natural features left. That green hedge is actually soldiers probably crouching. This is a line of men who are perhaps the opposition or what have you. And so charging towards a green hedge is a great deal more intimidating when you see it as members of a battle that could be the ones responsible for your death. We also need to think about the language that we've got in those opening lines. We've got the repetition of roar, roar. Let's think about that word raw. Now, if we were to describe a soldier as a raw recruit, it would mean that somebody who was new to it, probably somebody very young, someone who is not really much older than you. So this is somebody who lacks the entirety of experience of both battle and indeed life to be doing something as life-altering and possibly life-ending as this. And also, raw suggests discomfort. Literally, this could just mean the khaki, the uniform that they're wearing, how rough it was against the skin, but also the discomfort of the situation itself. If something is raw, it's like you're very much open to infection, or you're open to something else negative that could come your way. Right, we've got this sense as well that throughout the poem, we've got all of these references to how the natural world and the war become fused, how they merge. And when we see this idea in, I think it is the last stanza here, yeah, the idea of the hair. So line 16, this hair becomes something very disturbing. It's not a literal hair, it's like a hand grenade that's been thrown. And it's sort of like a hair that's caught fire. It's charging around in circles. You're not really knowing where it's going to land, where it's going to finish and explode. So it's really terrible. It's this whole idea of its destructive potential. So that curious, merging of the natural and the warlike world is a horrible thing. Man is causing untold damage through his conflict. I also want to mention the idea of, in stanza 2 now, thinking about this sense of fear. So we have got the use of questioning, all right, that is reflecting this idea of where am I, what am I doing? So the questioning that's used there is really very poignant in that. We've also got this sense of how the lines are enjambed here. That's going into structure a little bit again. And his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. The reason I'm talking about this in language, though, is simply because it's so very visual. We can actually see this man who is in total fear. You know how they say that your life kind of passes before your eyes, or things stand still when an accident is about to happen. That's exactly what you're seeing here. What I would say is we've also got some beautiful similes that are used in here. Line 8 is a great example. Sweating like molten iron. Isn't that horrible? It's like, sweat is almost painful to get out. That sense of true fear with that adrenaline coming through. It's like a sense of hell. It's like fire and brimstone. It's bringing that real, true realization of what battlefield life was like. So hellish, horrific. I would say the most crucial thing for me, if I were an examiner, what I would be looking for you to write about here is to be noting the verbs in the poem. They're absolutely crucial. So the sense of violence and immediacy is created through this, and immediacy is what you need to think about here, this sense of here and now, the moment. When we look at them, we've got words like through, plunged, smacking, slashed. They all really convey this brutal sense of war. Moving on to structure then, I want to think about the beginning of the poem, and I'm going to use what used to be a term that we would use if we were teaching media studies, for example. And I want you to think about action movies here, because there is a sense of that quality. And that is how this poem starts. It starts in medias res, and that is a Latin term that just means in the middle of the action. So with that word suddenly, we are thump, 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 straight away transported to what's going on the battlefields. That really is a true reflection of conflict. So if we're thinking about how the structure is mirroring the battle itself, that's a great one to talk about. In the poem, the length of the line varies. You can just see that visually. There is no sort of equality to how many syllables particularly are in the line there. And what we've got here is Hughes being very clever. He is a master of this type of thing. He's a brilliant poet, and he uses this to show the quick and slow progress of the soldier. So we've got this idea of the combination, fear with adrenaline and reason versus insanity. So those conflicting mental states, it's not just, as we've said already, the conflict that we're seeing that the man is in, but the conflict in his mind as he goes into that position. The poem is nicely divided again into sections, really, because the first stanza is all about action and running, and the soldier is awake within the first 6 words of the opening line. But the flow is then broken up by the use of dashes. This really does break up the fluidity of the poem, and it shows how the soldier is waking up to reality, what is really happening, and he's slowly starting to think. It's like he has an epiphany, that moment of sudden realization that this is do or die. It's that, whole decision that he has to make in a split second. The second stanza then really changes. It happens in that slow-mo, all right? It's slow motion. Note that the 3 lines that are broken in the middle are indicated by the caesura that's there, and that's lines 11, 14 and 15. It's the second half of line 15 that really breaks this spell, okay? He knows he has to rush without thinking towards his death in the final, towards his death in the final stanza. So he has to go forward. If he turns around and shows cowardice, he'll be shot. He has to go forwards. So at the start of the poem, you see the soldier instinctively obeying orders. This is the power of command. Sorry, my phone is going off there. But in stanza 2, he's got those moments of clarity when he's really thinking about what he's doing and time just seems to stand still. And in the end, we see that all of those earlier moral justifications that he had, such as fighting for king and country, they've all become meaningless. You saw that pretty much in Exposure too. What we see is that this man is nothing more than a weapon for king and country. He is a form of human bomb, and he's now just this weapon of war that is just dehumanized. It's almost like all their eyes are ice that we saw in Exposure in our previous session. A terrifying vision, I think, guys. I'm sure that you will really get plenty out of this. This was used, I think, in either the first or second year of the GCSE that you're now studying. That does not, by any stretch of the imagination, mean that it won't be used again, but it's one that you can really compare well with the other actual literal conflict poems within the anthology. It's also good for thinking about those situations where you would find yourself in mental conflict too. So my dears, I'm wishing you a very happy day, whatever you do. Take good care of yourselves, and I'll see you next week for another adrenaline charged poetry shot. See you later. Bye.